For the 200th birthday of Henrietta McBride Belnap, take some time to learn about her life, her struggles, and her talents. Knowing the stories of our ancestors binds us to them. We can turn to them during our hard days and challenges to find strength and peace. Here is her story.
Henrietta McBride was born on September 1st, 1821 in York, Livingston, New York, the oldest of 8 children born to her parents, James McBride and Betsy Mead. She and her parents joined the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints in 1833 in Chautauqua County, New York. In order to gather with other Latter-day Saints, Henrietta's family moved first to Kirtland, Ohio in 1837, then, due to persecution, to Missouri in 1838. On account of continued persecution, they moved again about a year later and settled in Illinois. Her father, James, became ill and died on August 13, 1839 in Pike County, Illinois, a few weeks before Henrietta's 18th birthday. Food was very scarce, and Henrietta, as the oldest child, would find what little work there was to help get food for the family. In the spring of 1841, Henrietta's mother relocated the family in Iowa on the west bank of the Mississippi River about 4 miles from Nauvoo. While her mother remained in Iowa, Henrietta moved to Nauvoo to find work so she could help provide for her family. In the spring of 1846, Henrietta, with her mother and part of her family, started preparations for their long journey west. Henrietta's family suffered miserably in the trek across Iowa. When they had only traveled about 30 miles, Henrietta's brother Harlem enlisted in the Mormon Battalion. By December 1846, the family's provisions were nearly gone. The nearest place to get supplies and provisions was about 75 miles away, and they had no money to buy food. Her brothers, James and Oliver, made the trek, and after 2 weeks they had earned a load of corn and returned home to plant a crop which they grew enough for a year's provision. In the spring of 1847, Henrietta's grandmother, Abigail Mead McBride, emigrated to Utah. The following spring, her brothers George and Oliver left for Utah, leaving behind Henrietta, her mother, and her brothers James and Nathaniel. While still living near the banks of the Missouri, Henrietta gave birth on April 16, 1851, to Annetta McBride. The child's father, according to some family records, was named Wells Smith. In 1851, Henrietta crossed the plains with her widowed mother Betsy and her brothers James and Nathaniel. They started for the Salt Lake Valley with 1 wagon, 1 yoke of oxen, and 2 cows. They had traveled about 150 miles when they lost their oxen and 1 cow, so they were forced to leave their wagon behind. Walking the rest of the way, they arrived in the Salt Lake Valley in the fall of 1851. In Utah, Henrietta and her family initially settled in Farmington, where she immediately found work to help the family. On June 26, 1852, Henrietta was married as the second wife of Gilbert Belnap by Brigham Young in the President's office in Salt Lake City, Utah. Gilbert's first wife, Adeline, was a first cousin to Henrietta. Henrietta and Adeline were very close, as were their children. With her marriage to Gilbert, Henrietta moved north to Ogden. Gilbert's 2 families lived in a log house on the southeast corner of Grant Avenue and 26th Street. Henrietta's daughter, Annetta, died on November 26, 1852, and was buried in the Ogden City Cemetery in the Belnap family plot. Less than 1 year later, on August 31, 1853, Henrietta gave birth to William James in Ogden. Henrietta gave birth to her second son, Oliver, on September 20, 1855, in Springville. Gilbert had been called to serve as a missionary in the Salmon River Mission, and Henrietta had gone to Springville to be at the home of her mother. Gilbert Belnap returned from his mission in 1857. Later that year, she gave birth to her third son, Francis Marion, in Ogden. Tensions were high in Utah after the 1857 announcement of Johnston's army marching to the Utah Territory. Brigham Young asked the Saints settled in the areas of Ogden and Salt Lake to move south to avoid the threat of impending soldiers. Henrietta and her children left their home in Ogden as participants in the move south on account of the Utah War. They resided for a season in Springville. On October 31st, 1860, Henrietta gave birth to her last child, Isadora Estella, in Farmington. Henrietta was a woman who never complained, although she was continuously moved from place to place. Around 1863, Henrietta moved with her children from Ogden to Huntsville. She was moved there by her husband to homestead the land and care for sheep. With the help of her eldest son, William James, they cared for the land and the sheep. After a few years, Gilbert sold the land and sheep and moved her back to Ogden. Henrietta lived in Ogden alongside Gilbert and Adeline in a log house situated on the east bank of the Weber River near present-day 24th Street. Henrietta and her 3 youngest children were next moved to Hooper in the early spring of 1868. Henrietta and her family used a wagon box for their first home, which was set on the ground among sagebrush. It contained their bed, clothing, and meager supplies. Without a camp stove, their cooking and baking was done over a campfire in a frying pan and kettle using sagebrush for fuel. They had no artificial light, not even a candle. During the cold weather, they would go to bed trying to keep warm. They melted snow for water or carried water from a distant spring. During the summer of 1868, Gilbert built Henrietta a log room. It was located on the western part of the 160 acres her husband was homesteading. Conditions eventually improved. Gilbert and Adeline and their children moved to Hooper, and the log house was replaced by an adobe structure. Henrietta had a natural ability to teach. She taught in the first school in Hooper, which initially was in her home and later in a log room schoolhouse. Here she had benches for her students made out of split logs. Henrietta first taught the children how to tell time. While her pupils were learning to write by tracing over letters on a slate, Henrietta would have the others read aloud to her. She taught her students the times tables and told them stories from the Bible and about the pioneers. The school children brought fruits, vegetables, and molasses to pay for their instruction. By 1878, Henrietta earned $25 per quarter for her teaching. Her students remember her as being kind, gentle, and an efficient teacher of children of various ages. Henrietta was also particularly fond of music and was quite musically gifted. After Henrietta's son Oliver lost his first wife in 1894, Henrietta took in Oliver's son Wilford, then 3 years old, to care for him. During the fall and winter of 1896, another grandson, William O. Belnap, moved in with Henrietta. Grandson Meade Belnap remembered stopping into Henrietta's house on their way home from school. Henrietta always had a pan of hot cornbread and molasses for them to eat. In the summer of 1897, Henrietta went with her son Oliver and his family to Moreland, Idaho. While going through the hardships of building up a new homestead, yet again, Henrietta cared for 5 of her grandchildren. As she grew older, Henrietta was bothered with rheumatism, which caused her fingers to twist and swell. In the fall of 1898, Henrietta's health failed and she came back to Hooper. She went to live with her daughter, Isadora Estella Belnap Stoddard. Her last days were spent in pain and suffering, although she never complained. Gilbert Belnap died on February 26, 1899. 6 months later, on September 5th, Henrietta passed away at the age of 78. Her funeral was held in the Hooper Ward Chapel, and she was buried in the Ogden Cemetery next to her pioneer husband of 46 years. On April 24, 1857, Henrietta wrote a letter to Gilbert while on his mission. In it, she explained what gave her strength in good times and in bad. A lesson left for all of us, she wrote, "I feel I must put my trust in the Lord and rely upon Him for strength to support me through every trying scene I may be called on to pass through in this life."